guys, and welcome to the Quiet Riot, where we talk film, television, and media with an emphasis on old movies, mysteries, and nostalgic favorites. I'm your host Ainsley, and today we're discussing Horror of Dracula, released in 1958 and released elsewhere as simply Dracula. It was released in the United States as Horror of Dracula because the Bela Lugosi film that was released in 1931 was still very popular at the time and was released pretty regular in American cinemas. So they decided to refer to it as Horror of Dracula in the US, and throughout this I will be referring to the film itself as Horror of Dracula and referring to the character as Dracula. This is Hammer Horror's first film featuring the character created by Bram Stoker in the original novel Dracula. And this is the first character that really brought the sensuality to the character and what was already present in the book by Stoker. And prior to this, the most popular rendition was certainly Bela Lugosi's rendition of Dracula that was released in 1931. And before that, it was Nosferatu, released in 1922. And fun fact, that film was actually illegal upon its release. It was an unauthorized adaptation. So the family tried to get it scrapped, and unfortunately for them, I guess, but fortunately for us, it is still available to watch. I love seeing a bunch of different renditions of the character of Dracula. We have ones that are darker, ones that are focused on the sexuality of the character, and ones that are focused a little bit more on the comedy of the character. And there's a little something for everyone depending on what movie you want or like. So far, I do really think that Horror of Dracula is the better of all of the Hammer Horror production Draculas that feature Christopher Lee as the character. This one really gets more into the overall sensuality and sexuality of the character, where I think he's a lot more, in my opinion, especially in some of the later ones, is more menacing and animalistic. That doesn't quite fit into the way I personally perceive Christopher Lee's take on the character. When there's an adaptation of any book, whether it is to stage or screen, film, or television, there are most likely going to be a lot of changes because not everything that's in the pages can really be adapted to be entertaining on screen. We can spend a lot more time with characters in a carriage because we get to know a lot more of their inner thoughts if they are the narrator, and we get a lot more detail of what is going on as opposed to witnessing them on stage or screen. In this case, a lot of the changes that were made were due to the limited budget that Hammer Horror Productions had at their disposal, but it also just made it easier to condense everything. So some of the big changes were having everything take place in a part of Central Europe. So there's not a part of Central Europe and then going back to England. So there's no time spent on the boat. So Demeter is not present here. There's also a lot of relationship changes in this and character changes. While they may have a lot of the personalities that existed in the novel, who they actually are as characters are quite different, beginning with Jonathan Harker. At the beginning, we meet Jonathan Harker as he arrives at Count Dracula's castle to take up post as a librarian. This is what he tells Dracula, but Dracula doesn't know that Jonathan Harker is actually a vampire hunter. He's actually a friend of Dr. Van Helsing, played by Peter Cushing. And here, Peter Cushing is a lot younger than the Van Helsing of the book, and apparently they wanted to hire him after the success of The Curse of Frankenstein, where he also plays opposite Christopher Lee, and in doing so, they ended up making the character a lot younger. I think that Peter Cushing himself was thinking that they should just hire someone else older, but due to the success and considering Cushing's career, Hammer Horror Productions knew that they had a goldmine on their hands with Cushing and really wanted to take advantage of that. And I really like his interpretation of this character. I kind of like the character being someone who's not this old man, but as somebody who's more middle-aged, or at least coming upon middle-aged, as I find that having him be of what I assume to be Dracula's age upon his turning into a vampire, that there seems like to be a little bit more of a dynamic that they can take on each other a lot more. There's a lot more sense of equals. Of course, Dracula is a lot much older than Van Helsing, but he can take him on a little bit more. The relationships in the novel has changed quite a bit, with Harker being friends with Homewood, Arthur Homewood, who is the husband to Mina, and his sister is Lucy, who is Harker's fiance. This is different than the novel. And in the novel, Harker is there to finish a real estate transaction where he ends up in the movie being a vampire hunter who is in search and trying to goat him out. And that definitely changes some of the dynamics, because Harker, instead of becoming a very innocent bystander that gets caught up in all of this, he is much more of an equal player in the same way that Van Helsing is, though he is taken down quite soon. My favorite character out of all this is definitely Van Helsing. I really love Peter Cushing's interpretation of this character. I don't know, I kind of have, I think, a bit of a crush on Peter Cushing, if I'm honest. He also had played Sherlock Holmes in an adaptation for Hammer horror films, The Hound of the Baskervilles, and I actually really liked his interpretation of that character as well, so I think I've got a bit of a crush on Cushing, and maybe that changes up some of my personal thoughts on this, but I love spending time with Cushing. I expected him to be in the film a lot sooner, but he was not. I think I also expected Dracula to be in this film a little bit more than he was. He has around like 10 minutes of screen time in total, though when it comes to the end, all of this and the way characters are introduced do make a lot of sense and do work a lot better for the film. Screenwriter Sangster decided to take out Dracula's shape-shifting ability from Dracula, stating, "I thought that the idea of being able to change into a bat or a wolf or anything like that made the film seem more like a fairy tale than it needed to be. I tried to ground the script to some extent in reality." I 100% agree with this, especially when you consider all the changes that were made before. Everything is a lot more isolated to a specific area in Central Europe. It's not this whole big thing. And so a little bit more of the adventure aspect of the book has been taken out of it. And so if you were to have these shape-shifting abilities, I do think it seems very out of place here, and I think it takes away, in my opinion, some of the mystery that the character of Dracula has about him. And while those things may work in the book or in certain films, depending on how they are adapted for the screen, I don't believe that in Horror of Dracula, him being a shapeshifter would have done any kind of service to the character of Dracula himself, but Horror of Dracula as a whole. At this point of time, I'm thinking that Christopher Lee's Dracula is my favorite iteration of the character. His interpretation and what was brought to screen by both Fisher and Sangster, and then what Lee brought to the character, really added something to it. There is that the character maintains the mystery that exists in the novel and that had been brought to the screen with Bela Lugosi in 1931, though the sensuality and sexuality of this character is brought forth to the screen. Terence Fisher believed, "My greatest contribution to Dracula myth was to bring out the underlying sexual element in the story. He is basically sexual. At the moment he bites, it is the culmination of a sexual experience." According to Fisher, Dracula preyed upon the sexual frustrations of his woman victims. The Homewood marriage was one of which she, Mina, was not sexually satisfied, and that was her weakness, as far as Dracula's approach to her was concerned. In the scene where Mina returns after a night with Dracula, Fisher's directions to the actress were frank and unambiguous. When she arrived back after having been away all night, she said it all in one close-up at the door. She'd been done the whole night through. I remember Melissa Stribling saying, "Terry, how should I play the scene?" So I told her, "Listen, you should imagine you have had one whale of a sexual night. The one of your whole sexual experience. Give me that in your face." The first time that we see Dracula with Mina is one of my personal favorites in the movie and one of my personal favorite moments of Dracula with Mina. And I say this because of the absolute subtle what Lee brought to the character and what both Sangster and Fisher had done in how subtle this scene is. And it's a relatively quick scene, but it is very much like seeing a seduction happen, and it happens rather quickly, but it also has this very kind of slow pace to it when he enters and then when he meets her, and the kind of slow move in to kiss her and go onto the bed. And I like the way that that is done to, one, be very sensual and to just kind of bring out the sexuality of the character and how he relates to these women that he's seducing. It never occurred to any of us to use anyone else but Chris Lee. Speaking of the filming and doing his take on the character, Lee recalled that he tried to make the character all that he was in the book: heroic, romantic, erotic, fascinating, and dynamic. And in the 10 minutes that we spend with the character of Dracula, I believe that you first see him as kind of being this very fascinating and dynamic person when he enters the room. You certainly seeing that heroic dynamic when what is another one of my favorite scenes and probably one of the best known of his rendition of his character, his interpretation of his character, is the red eyes and the blood coming down when he enters as the one vampire bride comes in and is going to bite Harker. I think that moment leans into the very heroic and dynamic character. You get the romantic and erotic side when you see him with the women, and you also get this sense of a heroic dynamic when he goes up against Van Helsing. Van Helsing is definitely the heroic person when it comes to this, but there's also this sense of the character of Dracula and a lot of characters like Dracula where they may be the villain of the story, but there is this essential, this sadness to these characters of this is not what they were intending of their life, and especially if they're not born that way and they're essentially just turned into a villain. So there's this heroic sense to the character, and I do think that Lee brings that to life really well. In an interview with Leonard Woolf for A Dream of Dracula, Christopher Lee stated, "I was always against the whole tie and tails rendition. Surely it is the height of the ridiculous for a vampire to step out of the shadows wearing white tie tails, patent leather shoes, and a full cloak." Lee said that he never watched any other performance of Dracula until well after making his films, and that when he got the first role with little time to prepare, he had to hurry off to read the book, and played it fresh with no knowledge of previous performances. Honestly, best way to do it, especially Bela Lugosi's interpretation of the character. In the same interview, Lee said the following about Dracula. He also had to have an erotic element about him. And not because he sank his teeth into women. It's a mysterious matter and has something to do with the physical appeal of the person who's draining your life. It's like being a sexual blood donor. Women are attracted to men for any hundreds of reasons. One of them is a response to the demand to give oneself, and what greater evidence of giving is there than your blood flowing literally from your own bloodstream? It's the complete abandonment of a woman to the power of a man. I mean, that could be taken in numerous ways. That definitely makes it a lot more of a horror story to women and femmes, certainly. Lee believed he had discovered something in the character that hasn't been done before, and also because I had read the book and I had perhaps discovered something in the character which other people hadn't, or had noticed, or hadn't decided to present. And that is that the character is heroic, erotic, and romantic. I've always tried to put an element of sadness, which I have termed the loneliness of evil, into his character. Dracula doesn't want to live, but he's got to. He doesn't want to go on existing as the undead, but he has no choice. Lee also felt that authenticity to Stoker's novel was important and was frustrated with his Hammer Dracula films. The stories, as I've had them given to me, have had almost no relation to the book, which is my reiterated complaint. My one great regret has always been that I have never been able to present the Count exactly as Bram Stoker described him in every way. This was always due to poor scripts and a lack of imagination on the part of people who have never seemed to understand the full potential of the story. With many changes to the source material, it's completely understandable if fans of Bram Stoker's work weren't too pleased with the changes. Lee himself wasn't a big fan of the differences, especially when he continued playing the character for Hammer Horror Productions. However, the receptions from critics and Stoker fans tell a different story. The trade journal reviews from 1958 were very positive. Full Film Bulletin noted, as produced by Anthony Hines in somber mid-Victorian backgrounds and directed by Terence Fisher with an immense flair for the blood-curdling shot, this Technicolor nightmare should prove a real treat. The James Bernard score is monumentally sinister and the Jack Asher photography full of foreboding atmosphere. I also really like that in this they talked about the direction, but also talking about how the score and the photography added to this atmosphere and that they got a shout out here. Oftentimes you'll find that the people who get the shout out are simply the directors and the actors. Is that the case always? No. But when they want to say something negative, they'll talk about other, like the crew and other people. So it's always nice to hear the positivities about other crew members and what they've done to bring things alive. He called Peter Cushing's performances impressive and wrote that the serious approach to the macabre theme adds up to lots of tension and suspense. Harrison's reports was particularly enthusiastic. Of all the Dracula horror pictures thus far produced, this one made in Britain and photographed in Technicolor tops them all. Its shock impact is in fact so great that it may well be considered as one of the best horror films ever made. What makes this picture superior is the expert treatment that takes full advantage of the story's shock values. Vincent Canby in Motion Picture Daily said, Hammer Films, the same British production unit which last year restored Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to its rightful place in the screen's Chamber of Horrors, has now even more successfully brought back the granddaddy of all vampires, Count Dracula. It's chillingly realistic in detail and at times as gory as the law allows. The physical production is first rate, including the settings, costume, Eastman color photography, and special effects. It is weird because I've been watching a lot of old movies that are way older than this movie. I love a lot of films from the 1930s, horror or not. And being someone who watches a wide variety of films and a wide variety of horror, from silent films all the way up into things released this year, it's weird thinking of how like this can be in any sense considered gory. But I do love the way Hammer Horror does blood. It does have that very like same sense to it of Corman and the Argento films, and that bright color that kind of just looks like a thick nail polish. It works very well. It doesn't have the same sense of goriness as those of us who grew up with things like Saw would really maybe think is gory, but it certainly adds to this mix of something being grounded in our own reality, but almost like as if we're kind of living in our own nightmare. In literature and on stage and screen, Dracula has a long-standing legacy as king of the vampires. In Horror of Dracula, the Count's design and Lee's interpretation of the character introduced a part of the character that would be utilized in fiction for years to come. Christopher Frayling writes, Dracula introduced fangs and red contact lenses, decolletage, ready prepared wooden stakes, and in the celebrated credit sequence, blood being spattered from off-screen over the Count's coffin. Tim Stanley stated, Lee's sensuality was subversive in that it hinted that women might quite like having their neck chewed on by a stud. Hey, I get it. Dracula adapts the novel for the changing times it was in. Horror of Dracula, made in 1957 and released in 1958, the film manages to entice audiences to this day thanks to Lee's portrayal of the character. Gone are the times where moderate sensibilities wouldn't let filmmakers bring the full Dracula to life. Horror of Dracula brought the repression felt by its female characters, the sensuality and sexuality of the Count to life. While there has been many adaptations since, including other films starring Christopher Lee, not much can match Lee's performance. Made in Technicolor with the Hammer horror flair, Horror of Dracula has a campy nature with a sophisticated edge. Today, much is said about what the character represents and what vampires as a whole mean. Dracula, as written by Sangster and portrayed by Lee, gave a representation of Dracula's story and an inspiration for vampires in modern fiction. I look back at Christopher Lee's portrayal of Dracula and Horror of Dracula as being a real turning point that would propel the character into what modern audiences view Dracula as well as vampires. In the vampire versus werewolf debate, there is this sense more so of what someone would rather be and what someone is and might be dealing with. These characters and the lore that they have could be represented and are meant to represent something else depending on who is doing the adapting, who's the writer, who's the director, and who's portraying. With the vampire and werewolf debate, you have a character who is simply a man, and one who you have the character vampire, man, woman, non-binary, gay, straight. It doesn't matter, but there's a sexuality there, and there's also something else that comes with the sexuality in terms of something that almost can't be helped, this sense of desire, this thing that you have to stop from doing. And in certain senses, that can be seen with very religious tones, as Stephanie Meyer had done, and there is the sexuality and a sensuality that comes out of Horror of Dracula, brought in by the repression that was in the Victorian era. And the fact that this came out in the 1950s is not lost on me. The 1950s were a time when there was a lot of that repression and people were kind of getting out of that. And I think women themselves were seeing things and like, I want my own bank account, okay? I want some freaking freedom here. So I don't know, I see a lot of that in, while there is this hold that the character of Dracula has over Mina and these other women, they're also getting this other sense of freedom from the repression of their daily lives. I guess the reason that I decided to bring up werewolf lore is because I wanted to entice you to stick around on the Quiet Riot, subscribe, and ring that bell to be notified every single time that I post so you will not miss a video. And if you enjoyed this video, I would love you to like it. I really enjoy talking about lore and horror right now. I'm going to be doing a lot more of that in the future. I will be doing films that aren't horror related. I want to do some things for December. So if you do have any recommendations for some Christmas movies, especially foreign Christmas movies or holiday movies, not just Christmas, that are like from other holidays of December, please feel free to put that in the comments below. Tell me what you think of Horror of Dracula, what you think of Christopher Lee's interpretation of the character, and is this your favorite of the Hammer Horror Dracula films? Is this your favorite Dracula film? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Always feel free to recommend films or make requests. You can do that on any video. You can also do that in any community post that I have right now. I don't have a lot of people commenting, so I'm definitely gonna see them. If I either don't want to do it for whatever reason, I will reply to you and just let you know, or if I find that it's going to be a while until I get to that, I'll also let you know. I want to try to make this a great little film community where people can find things that they love or connect with people on things that they love. And so I would also like you to share with me some things that you love in the comments. It would be cool, and it will also help me with the algorithm demons and devils out there. So please let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye!